Welcome, everybody, to episode 29 of The Hopeful Majority. I'm your host, Manu Meal. Today's question is going to be, what is the outrage industrial complex? And we're going to have filmmaker and journalist Rob Feld join The Hopeful Majority. He recently came out with a hit short film called Jesters and Fools, which features comedians and talks about social media and outrage and all that good, exciting stuff. So we're going to get into that conversation. As you know, usually I have a monologue and then we'll do a conversation. So every Monday, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, that's where you get this content. I appreciate you tuning in. Let's get to the monologue about the outrage industrial complex, and then I'll hear you and join me with the conversation with Rob Feld. The outrage industrial complex. So I don't know how many of y'all have heard of the term the military industrial complex. It was a term created by President Eisenhower in one of his last speeches. He coined this intersection between corporations, profit, industry, and the military. And the idea was that we've got this entire industrial complex of companies like Lockheed, Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, these gun manufacturers, et cetera. And then they are interlinked with war. And it's almost becoming a business, that there's a profit incentive to continue to drive conflict. Interestingly enough, there's recently, as you know, with the hopeful majority, a big goal of this conversation as well is to start fighting outrage. And it almost seems like outrage itself is now also being commodified, and that there is such a thing as an outrage industrial complex, that you make a ton of money from being outraged, that you make a lot of content from being outraged. What gets shared on social media? It's the crazy shit, right? And this notion that we on the podcast actually know what will trend, and yet I choose to stay away from it because I can feed you the red meat about President Trump or President Biden or whoever it is that you dislike, and yet that doesn't actually help the country, and it doesn't advance the conversation, doesn't do anything. And so how do we fight this outrage industrial complex where on social media you're incentivized to say the craziest things, or as a politician you're incentivized to run to your temperamental extreme to win an election? Or there was an interesting stat that Rob shared with me on the conversation, that 7% of all users generate about 73% of all political tweets on X. Think about that. So are we even that divided? Or is it that the outrage industrial complex is feeding these conflict entrepreneurs, and it's driving a small minority of the population that exists across the ideological spectrum to go to the craziest ends because they want your attention? And that seems to be the fundamental challenge of the moment. The challenge is not whether or not we're incredibly polarized or we're incredibly divided. Yes, we're divided. Yes, we're polarized. But guess what? The country's always been divided. The country's always been polarized. American democracy has been riddled with conflict and challenge and discord and tumult. Just take a look at the 60s, for example, and evidence of that. And yet this time it seems different. And I think what I learned from this conversation is that the reason why it's different is, yes, there's social media. Yes, there is this sense that we have to now confront difference on a daily basis online. In the past, you never had to worry about what the person in Alabama is doing or what the person in New York City is doing. And now you're constantly seeing the person in New York City and the person in Alabama. But it also seems like there's money to be made, and that there's clicks to be had, that the profit and business incentives align. And the question becomes not only how do you disrupt that matrix of profit and business and outrage, which leads to unending polarization and toxic division, but how do you actually cut through it with human nature? Because you know what else is unfortunately true about the outrage industrial complex? It's incredibly funny and it's easy to make fun of. If you just observed an individual and the content they consume on a daily basis, I mean, who wants to be in a society where you're driven by the crazy stuff that you see all the time? Who wants to be in a society where, as Rob and I talk about, you're driven by constant outrage because that's what drives you on a daily basis? It's not fun. It's not healthy. And in fact, it disrupts our daily views and acts of life. And so this conversation really is about how you disrupt our sense and desire for outrage. And importantly, how do you talk about it in culturally compelling ways? Because as we always talk about on this show, this is not a problem of creating a bunch of squishy ideological moderates. I have a lot of strong beliefs. I'm sure you have a lot of strong beliefs. But the problem about outrage and the problem that we live in today, I don't think has anything to do with ideology, and it has everything to do with what I call temperament, the y-axis. Are we open-minded? Or are we closed-minded? Do we want to live in a society where we shut people out, or do we want to live in a society where we bring people in? This is a question of being divided along lines of mindset and behavior, not necessarily ideas. I think we need to get away from this notion that you can have strong passion and conviction and yet still be moderate in our temperament. That engaging in a debate and a discussion with somebody does not mean that all of a sudden you don't believe what you believe in. Just let's say I'm a really avid climate change protester and somebody that strongly believes in the climate that is changing and believes we need action urgently. Just because I engage in a discussion with somebody that might disagree with me does not mean that I'm less passionate about resolving climate change. It just means that maybe I might want to convince somebody that I disagree with. And yet, the outrage industrial complex does not incentivize that. And that's what we want to talk about. It's time to change it. It's time to reform it. Let's incentivize and build a world defined by nuance, because we are much more complex than the outrage and conflict entrepreneurs will have you believe. So with that, let's get into the conversation with Rob Feld. Mr. Rob Feld, welcome to the Hopeful Majority.
How you doing, bud?
I'm all right. I mean, we've already established that it's very dry where you are right now. You were tearing up before the conversation, and we haven't even started, so it's only downhill from here.
It's the East Coast cold, yeah.
So I don't know if this is a good or bad omen, but my mic stand broke right before our recording, and so as a result, I have to hold this like this, and this makes it look extra, as the young people say, authentic, and so this is my authentic setup. And
I was so impressed actually when I first saw it. I was like, wow, this is really I kind of wanted you to with like that old time radio mic, the big metal thing that says CBS on it.
See, it broke. The outrage industrial complex broke the microphone.
After you.
So look, you and I have met a couple of times, and you've obviously got this really interesting, fascinating short film out called Jesters and Fools, which features modern day jesters, aka comedians, and is a really interesting social commentary. We've met a couple of times, but I don't actually know you too well beyond the fact that you're a New Yorker in withdrawal. So could you just run it from the top? Like what should I know about you to ask the right questions?
Yeah, it says so much though, New Yorker in withdrawal. I'm a refugee. I'm a New York refugee. In the last few years in the pandemic, so many of us have kind of, been forced out. So I'm in an undisclosed location on the outskirts of Manhattan, is what I'll say.
Good.
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm a New York boy, born and bred, and I got out a couple years for college, came right back, started working in indie film and writing on film for journals. So, for many, many years, I'm a journalist. I'm a filmmaker. I do brand content for agencies and different brands. I make films that play festivals. And I teach a class at NYU, a filmmaking class. I kind of have led this film life. And
why film?
It's such a damn cliche, but I saw The Graduate in 9th grade, and that was it for me. Like, I did theater. I grew up going to theater and doing theater in school and photography and art and writing and all kinds of things. And then you see The Graduate and you're like, oh, this is how everything can come together in a way that that communicates so brilliantly. And then you just set about trying to do that for the rest of your life. It's a disease, really.
It's a disease.
Yeah.
Well, in an era where it seems like everybody's afflicted with something,
might as well be
being afflicted with the desire to make films is not bad. Hey, do you know this person named Ben Recchi by any chance? I had him on a couple of episodes ago. He's also a filmmaker. He had produced this documentary called The Reunited States. And the reason why we actually had a conversation was because the documentary actually flopped. And what's really interesting is that we had a conversation about why it flopped and like the problems with messaging unity these days in culture, how it all kind of sounds squishy and fluffy. Have you thought about any of that as you like sort of wage into the work that you're doing?
I have, and I have too many thoughts on it, but what was his take on why he thought it flopped?
Two things, I think. Hopefully I'm representing Ben's take correctly, but essentially like the first one is that it's telling a story without much conflict, that, there's like, people got resolved, they were happy, and it worked. That there's these hardworking people across the country, everyday folks that are trying to bring their communities together, and that's kind of it. And it didn't his claim was that we have to tell these stories with more conflict. But the second thing was just that a lot of these messages can oftentimes have this like kumbaya resonation, and it actually goes a little bit to your film when I was just watching it, where our social media does not incentivize nuanced, complex stories. It incentivizes like the house is burning down. Here's what's going on, and then you drive clicks. So he felt like the incentive structures weren't aligned. So that was his perspective.
It's interesting. Well, I mean, first, let me just, so anyone who listens here has a sense. I mean, the story, what the film is it's a look at what social media is doing to us, and media in general, how it affects our perceptions of each other, of ourselves, how it warps the perceptions. It makes us believe we have far more to fear from each other than we do. We have far more difference than we do. We're more polarized than we actually are. It exaggerates for us. It puts in this tight little frame the most extreme versions of the quote other side, so that you can fear them and think that they're coming to your living room to get you. And so what I use in Gestures and Fools, which is a precursor to a larger project I'm working on with Chris Bale at Duke University, is it uses comedians to talk about what they see. And they're kind of the canaries in the coal mine sometimes, or they're the philosopher kings that give sometimes metaphor, sometimes some humor and warmth to the social science that Chris Bale talks about. And so, back to your question. When I approach this project, what my frustration with media, and even with documentaries, when we talk about these subjects, when we talk about each other, or the left and the right, is that look, it's I think it's too frequently one side talking about the other side, and at best it winds up being one side being condescending to the other side, and at worst it's one side really vilifying the other side. And it's not coming from a point of common humanity, or hey, this is an experience that everyone, I don't care what side you think you're, whatever, everyone can come and experience and not feel like they're being spoken about or objectified or condescended to. And that is, I think, why it has resonated. So, in choosing
it being your film,
my film. So, I mean, I'll tell you what. So, my egregious example of films in the past couple of years is Don't Look Up. And, I don't know if you got to see it.
You don't like it?
Not a fan? I do not. Okay. And
well, don't look at it.
So here's the thing. I didn't find it funny, but aside from that, like, that's your first sin. But aside from that, it's a story that's a thinly veiled allegory about global warming, and it's supposed to be, at least some people thought it was, talking to global warming skeptics and trying to say, hey, look, what. But when I'm watching it, I'm saying, what this thing is really saying is, hey, all you people, we know you're really a little simple-minded and easily manipulated by these sophisticated, cynical media figures. So come with us now, and we won't blame you for the end of the world. And by the way, you should really be eating organic salmon at $30 to $50 a pound in this weird aside before the Last Supper. I don't know why that's there. So that then we can make a movie about this terrible salmon fisherman who overfished the salmon. And I see that, and like, who do you think you're winning over? Who are you talking to, right? All you're doing is talking to the people who are already in your camp, and they get to kind of scoff at those other people. And you've made no converts. You've only just alienated people. And I think that is what happens with so much of documentary that gets a political documentary. That rather than saying, hey, look, how much we have in common, just our basic humanity, and coming from the assumption that everyone is basically well-intentioned. They're evil, terrible people, no question.
Do you think that's a dangerous assumption to make?
That everyone's well-intentioned? I mean, yeah, everyone's the hero of their own story, right? Even look, even Hitler thought he was, on the side of the gods, right? That's, a ridiculous example. But look, I do think most people are well intentioned. Of course, they're just trying to get from A to B. They're just trying to live long enough to die in peace, really. They've got families if they're lucky, or they're alone and they're lonely. They're just trying to, survive, make a living without, get to the end without too much suffering. That's really it. Most people are
How
not.
do you respond to somebody and be like, that's like, Rob, that sounds naive. That sounds naive as hell. That your assumption is that the average person is well intentioned. I'm asking that question actually purposefully because, interestingly enough, it's come up in many conversations, and every time this notion of well intentioned individuals come up, there almost seems to be that's the split or the fork in the road between human nature and which path you take. Because I think that, let's say you don't assume that people are well intentioned, then I could see why it's justifiable to take the don't look up approach and just hit people over the head with what you think ought to be right. So, why are you not naive for thinking that people are well intentioned?
Well, two things. Like, well, it can't be the right choice because it doesn't work. Like, you can't annihilate. Let's just say, most people are not well intentioned. Unless you can't annihilate them, right? You can't destroy them. So, and they vote. So, unless you think
You can't get rid of, or you can't get rid of them.
you can't kill everybody you disagree with, nor should you want to, right? So, if it's whatever you think, it's not
Flip
going to
that.
work. So, you better approach them as if they're human beings, because they are, by the way. But why do I think? I don't know, man. I mean, I've traveled good chunks of the planet, and it's rare that I meet a truly ill-intentioned person who just wants to cause chaos. And by the way, there are those people. There are absolutely those people, and you see them online. They're frustrated people, and they just want to cause chaos because of their own pain. And that's maybe 13% of the population. It's not 20, it's not 50%. It's a small percentage of the population that are really just trying to cause chaos. In which case, it's not about an issue. It's not that they disagree with you. It's that they've got other shit going on and other pain in their life. And, you can't argue with them. You can't convince them. There's just other stuff going on.
Do you
So,
think
yeah.
those people should be approached? What do you think is that, or are they a lost cause?
By whom, I guess, is the question. Like,
The people.
I don't think that I can change a mind with a movie. I think that personal interventions go a much, longer way. I think that, look, when you and I were in New Hampshire, right, at the National Governors Convention, and Amanda Ripley had this great presentation where she took a group from an Upper West Side synagogue, brought them down to to rural Michigan, and so they're a very left-leaning group, and then brought them down to rural Michigan with a community of prison guards. And they stayed in each other's homes. And then the Michigan folks came up to New York and stayed with them. And not that they agreed with each other on any particular issue, but by the end, they had a respect for each other. They had an intimacy. They had an understanding. That is not something that can scale, but it is a way that you can, I think, get more extreme personalities to relate to each other. I work in media. I do think we're fighting a media war because so much of our perception of each other comes through these frames that we have, these phones or these screens that concentrate an image. That it's either by a person or a thing is creating this image for us of each other, and it misses everything outside the frame, and we don't recognize that. So I make media. I want to fight a media war with better media that's more three-dimensional. So that's what I can do. So
And let me let me stop you right there. There's something so interesting you just said, actually, and I've been thinking about this a lot. So there's like sort of three threads I want to bring together right there. One is, you said that you rarely meet the crazy person that you see on Twitter in real life. And to be frank, I've never met them. Like, where are they? Where's the crazy commenting person? I still have to meet somebody in my life that actually goes into a YouTube video and just rages. So that's one thread, right? The second thread you said is that most people are relatively well intentioned. and it's a question of telling the positive interaction stories, right? Like the thing that Amanda did with the synagogue. And then number 3 is that instance of engagement is not scalable, but if you tell the story properly, it is, because the only story that's out there is of all the crazy moments. So my question is, why are all the stories out there of just the crazy moments?
Oh, well, that's just good conflict storytelling. I mean, if it bleeds, it leads, right? I mean, that's what attracts. So I'll tell you one thing. Out of Chris Bale, so Chris Bale at Duke, who I'm doing this.
And could you give context for the audience? Who is Chris Bale?
Yeah, so Chris Bale is a computational social scientist at Duke University. He founded the Duke Polarization Laboratory, and they study polarization online. And he uses classical social science technique, but also hardcore data science, AI, all those good old buzzwords that involve math that are just
That
not
make him sound smart. He's smart. That's
thing.
the punchline.
He's a rather smart guy. What he what were we on? Sorry, I got off this point.
Yeah, so Chris and you are working together, and essentially you're telling me about Chris's sort of story of how he brings together the conflict entrepreneurs. And the question that I'd asked you is, why are the only stories out there?
Right. So there was this. So one in the social science experiment that he ran and wrote about in his book called "Breaking the Social Media Prison." He wanted to test this idea of information silos or filter bubbles, or whatever we call them this week, right? And so he took a group of big swath of Americans across the political spectrum, and he basically infiltrated their social media feeds, testing this idea. And if you identified as being on the left, you would get everything from, let's say, David Brooks to InfoWars. And if you were on the right, you would get everything from the New York Times, Maureen Dowd, to Mother Jones, and see what happens.
Sounds like modern day torture.
It is modern day torture. That you've just described social media is what you've done. And so, testing the idea, like, look, if we're not seeing each other's information, then we'll never agree. So we should moderate our views in theory if we see each other's stuff. And what actually ended up happening in this experiment, which was repeated a few times, is that it just pushed people deeper into their corners. If you were a more extreme person, you got better at articulating your side's point of view. You found the other side more menacing. You had more animosity towards the other side. You thought they were more of a threat. And if you were a centrist individual, which is most of America, you just disappeared from conversation. You went, this is a dumpster fire. There's nothing hidden here for me. I'm out. And all that was left were the extremists, right? And so, but some of what came out of his work is some myth busting that, this idea that we don't see each other's stuff is actually not true. If you get stuff online, you are seeing a broad swath of things. However, you are more likely, to your point, to go for the red meat. So if I'm on the left and a David Brooks op-ed comes into my feed, as does an Alex Jones, flame-throwing thing, which am I going to read? I'm going to read the Alex Jones thing because it's fucking crazy, right? And then I'm going to go over time. All those people over there are crazy. They're all Alex Jones. And Alex Jones comes to represent everybody.
He's everybody.
He's everybody. And so, that's an effect. And so some of it is that, we see the most extreme versions of those people over there. And then our assumptions of how extreme those people are over there are exponentially too large. Our assumptions of how much they hate us are exponentially off base. And so we end up in this place of heightened polarization. It's an illusion. And so how do you break that?
And we're going to get there, but it's so interesting. I'm writing down my notes. Not everybody on the right is Alex Jones, and
not everybody on the left is Ocasio-Cortez.
Damn. Now politics all of a sudden
bad
complex.
Media.
Now politics is all of a sudden complex. There's more than just
man.
Alex Jones and AOC. So Look, it's so funny that you mentioned that there's this almost this notion that we misunderstand or overestimate how crazy the other is. I was at this college recently and we were doing a talk about just bridging and differences and all that. And these students were like, "We're just never going to talk to a Republican." And I asked them, "When was the last time you actually talked to a Republican?" And they just didn't raise their hands. They couldn't tell you. And alternatively, we went to a Republican club and they're like, "We're never going to talk to a liberal." And I was like, "When did you actually last talk to a liberal?" And they're like, "I can't tell you, but I've read all the Mother Jones articles or I've read all the Alex Jones garbage." And so we're developing our perceptions of each other without ever actually having met people.
Yeah.
How do you break through that?
It's
Come on,
it's
give us the
you
solutions.
want me? Yeah, I have the
Answer
answer
the
because
yeah,
I have the
you
answer.
left New York. What else do you have to
Sitting
live
in an
for?
undisclosed location outside of Manhattan, I have the answer. Uh, yeah, look, I mean, it's particularly hard because geographically we're sorting ourselves, right? I mean, so if how many people left California for Texas and Florida and during the pandemic, or left New York, or moved from and so increasingly we do not live near people who disagree with us, and so you end up with this massive confirmation bias problem, and you completely miss what's who your countrymen are. But Mo Amer, who's a comedian in the documentary,
Mhm.
speaks in his stand up and in conversation about his neighbor, or his old neighbor, because now he's like, I'm wealthy now, I moved, but his old neighbor, who I forget, he calls himself redneck something or other, and he's like, I love him, he loves me with his kids. He's like, my name's Muhammad, I've never had a problem going touring this country, and he's whatever, I'm heterodox person, and we don't agree on things, but I love him to death, and he's my next door neighbor.
Mhm.
How do you break through it? I mean, some of it, look, it's us. We all have to be open. You can't lead when you meet someone with, look, if you start out, and everyone in New York, I'm afraid at this point, kind of does this. And I had a neighbor. In Manhattan who, it was like within 2 iterations of small talk, hey, how's your day? How's the weather? Would get to something hyperbolic and political. And in out of nowhere, out of context, you're like, oh, how's your day? Oh, it's fine. We're thinking about going on vacation. Oh, where? Well, we wanted to go to Florida, but we don't want to give DeSantis our money. Like, he's not getting your, like, just go
Don't
sit
let
in the
DeSantis
beach.
ruin Miami Beach for you people.
Yeah, go sit in the beach, man. Get some sun. I don't know, like, relax. Yeah. So, if that's your virtue signaling persona, or you can do it from the other side as well. If you're on the right and you start out with something,
It's like I would never go to LA to feed, Gavin Newsom's pockets.
yeah, exactly. You're not letting a conversation happen.
Hmm.
And you're immediately turning off people. And by the way, there are conservatives or liberals all around you, less so, but absolutely they are. But they're afraid they just think you're going to hate them. And they think you do hate them. So they're not saying anything, and they're not being open with you about, who I am. And if you're in the office and you say something extreme politically, no one's going to give you a little pushback because they don't want to get into that. They're not even, well, I don't know if that's really what things are, but okay. They're not going to get into it with you. So these conversations just don't happen because everyone assumes the worst of everybody else.
Everyone assumes the worst of everybody, and there also seems to be this weird negative connotation around the word centrist. And I want to run an idea by you, which is that you mentioned that, almost everybody is a centrist. And for the longest time, I used to think about it from the left right standpoint that, okay, almost everybody's kind of in the middle ideologically. But interestingly enough, I know people that are incredibly passionate that are also open-minded, that there isn't this trade-off between convictions and just being normal. Like, you and I can have a conversation, that doesn't mean I suddenly believe less in my desire for X, Y, or Z issue.
Sure. Yeah.
So the thing that I've been thinking about is this really a question of ideology, or is there a new axis to our politics, like a new divide? And that's a divide of temperament, of
Oh
mindset.
yeah.
of being, is it much more than our politics? It's just about, are you open-minded or not? And open-minded or not has nothing to do with where you stand on the political spectrum. What do you think about that concept?
When all the time when I talk about this, I say, most people are centrist, and I say that can be either centrist politically or temperamentally centrist. Because they're absolute. You can and perhaps should be passionate about your understandings of the world, but there's a difference. There's a great difference between being intellectually curious with your ideas and thinking that anyone who disagrees with you must be an evil, terrible person, that they're wrong-headed, that they're coming at it from a bad place. They must be stupid. They must be racist. They must be this. They must be that. Because overwhelmingly, it's not true. There are plenty. Look, you're not going to get me saying there aren't a lot of stupid people in the world. There's a lot of stupid people in the world, and there's racist people.
Breaking news.
But that's, a very flat, two-dimensional way of looking at the world and looking at people. And that's not even necessarily, there are going to be plenty of stupid people who agree with you. So what's your excuse? I don't know.
Yeah. It's you
might be one of them, by the way. So
what? How dare you? I'm stupid? No. Everybody else is, Rob. Come on. Especially the ones that disagree with me.
Exactly.
So it's interesting, the one of the comedians, and for context for people that are just catching on, in the Jesters and Fools, the short film that Rob created with his partner Chris Bale, there's a bunch of comedians, and I want to ask you why comedians anyway. But let's parking like that for a quick second. One of the things that I think his name is Jim Norton says that outrage is never sparked, right? That there's no when somebody resurfaces a tweet. And the news is a tweet has just been resurfaced. It's not like the tweet just magically resurfaces. Someone pulled the damn tweet out of the ether, right? And so it's almost like the media is gee, I wonder where this outrage is fucking starting from. But there's outrage out there now, so it's sparked.
He's a genius, Jim Norton. So unappreciated.
Could you talk a little bit about what he means by this fact that outrage is never just sparked, that somebody's actually putting gas on the fire?
Well, yeah, there's a few things. One, there's a statistic that it's a Pew statistic, and it's a few years old now, so I'm sure it's mutated a little bit, but the idea remains the same, that, it's 6% of all Twitter users create 73% of all political tweets. And what I think it.
Could you say that number again?
Yeah, 6%, only 6% of all Twitter users are creating 73% of all the political tweets. So think about that,
I've heard of a similar stat.
Cone or whatever the graph would look like. And then you think about how many Americans are actually on Twitter. And I think I could be wrong. You got to check me on this. I think it was something like 20% of all of, so to look at anything happening on Twitter as representative of anything is statistically absurd, right? So, it's the news will report Twitter blew up today when, a grandmother said, it's 6 people, disaffected people in their, mother's basement, freaked out on Twitter. And it caused enough of a, chain reaction and algorithm to hype it, whatever. And then some, local news channel picks it up, and then a broader news channel picks it up. And all of a sudden it's a firestorm over something that a couple of people sparked by, an algorithm or enhanced by an algorithm, decided to, virtue signal or just get attention, wanted some attention. And the more hyperbolic thing they say, the more attention they get. So it's an illusion. And what does Norton mean? He's like, look, how many people are busy in their lives, and how many people, outrage sparked over somebody's tweet. Most people are going about, just trying to, like I said, make a living, raise their kids, go get to the doctor, pay a bill. They're not walking around fuming with outrage over a 10-year-old tweet that a comedian made and then maybe even, forgot or apologized for, whatever. But, someone goes looking for something and brings it to the fore, and, and everyone can enjoy freaking out about it for one news cycle until we move on to get outraged about something else. Outrage is so satisfying. is really what he's talking about. You know, it makes you feel self-righteous. It occupies you. And, you know, and Colin Quinn talks about, you know, what would you know? Would you rather sit around and with your boring job, or, you know, stare at your phone and get angry about something and feel like you're right? You finally understand something in the world in this chaotic place. So it's the satisfaction of outrage, and it makes for an untenable democracy.
Do you think there's an outrage industrial complex?
There is an outrage industrial there's a great book, I have it right here, called The Outrage Industry.
Damn, I didn't come up with that.
You didn't. But it's been thought about. It's a great book. It's a study. It talks about a good deal of how outrage became a commodified product, really, because and how, you know, instances or outrageous expressions of outrage became more common in journalism, how certain words started to become more popular, and a lot of that has to do with what has to do with broadband and how technology evolved and how media companies needed to find niche audiences. You know, when it used to just be a couple channels and the news could just report facts, that's what it was. But all of a sudden, you've got all these different outlets that need to get a really a small but loyal base. And so you've got Fox News, you've got MSNBC, the New York Times has to float further to the left, and the New York Post has to go to the right, and you have a solid niche audience, because otherwise you're going to go bankrupt.
And 6% of all tweets, or 73% of all tweets, are generated by 6% of users. So you've got
73% of political tweets.
Of all political tweets. I actually, by the way, I saw another version of that stat where I think it's actually 7% might be all political tweets. I've heard that 10% of users generate all of user-generated content on Twitter. So, and that was in 2019, 2020. So it's not that much more. And I think the point still stands that you've got outrage commodified. You've got 7% of people dominating the political discourse. You've got the media selling out to the people that are engaging on this discourse. And so naturally, then the question becomes that the business model is stacked against, you know, whatever it is that you're trying to do. And so, and that I'm trying to do. So the question becomes, how do you start to switch the incentives? Because I feel like we're climbing up. It's almost like a Sisyphean task. You know, we're trying to push against a force that you are literally incentivized to do the opposite of, because it's in your financial interest.
Yeah, I don't think you can. Like, you can't change the New York Times or Fox News or Emily. They're gonna, if they see some financial incentive elsewhere, they'll go that way. But, you know, that would
like, what if everybody tomorrow started liking or sharing content that wasn't red meat? Like, what if you inoculated, like, I almost think about this as like junk food, right? Like, when there's a massive explosion of junk food in the country, the like, nutrition labels aren't just a thing that just always existed. The FDA came in the 40s, 50s, 60s. They came in and they said, look, we're going to start regulating this, and not from a content standpoint, but we're going to regulate this from a consumption standpoint. So we're going to educate you on what you're eating. Now, I don't know if it worked, because 50% of the country is still obese, unfortunately. But, like, is there maybe a question of educating the consumer? Like, tomorrow, if everybody that was watching the news demanded something different, wouldn't it change?
Oh, yeah, but they're not going to.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, so they're not going to. You still have to appeal.
But then why do they keep complaining about it? If you're not going to change your consumption habits, then stop being pissed about how polarized everything is.
Well, I guess, you know, yes, you're totally right. A. B. Look, I mean, Fox News, for example, has a relatively small audience. It's a very loyal audience, right? It's CNN too, like all of them. Like, it's not like the whole country is watching these networks, but very loyal bases that, you know, are certainly enough to make lucrative television networks do watch them. Everyone else, you know, I don't know what they're doing, honestly. Some read newspapers, some, you know, half of Americans are not politically engaged at all.
Yeah, I think most people have just unplugged.
They're not. I mean, they're most Americans are just not political. You know, and that isn't to say they don't have beliefs or understandings, but they're certainly not political. So, I mean, that just look at that. If we think the whole country is at war, it's not, because half the country is, just doing their own thing anyway.
Half the
So
country is Switzerland.
yeah, half the country is Switzerland, or an ostrich. But so look, everyone will. Here's my hope, I guess, is the answer, and it goes to what I was trying to do with the movie. I do, and why I made it, and why I'm the audience for it. And I think many of us are walking around with just like a great pain in our chest, because we feel a loss of, maybe it's a loss of national community, maybe it's a loss of community in general, of connection, which of course, which is a much larger technological thing with everyone living in their phones and even working from home these days. But I think that if I can respond with something to that need for, hey, I'm not alone. It's not just me. I'm not the only one who thinks this is nuts. I grew up in Manhattan at a time when, we in high school, we'd sit by the lockers, we'd call each other's commies and fascists, and then we'd go play handball, right? And that was that. And it was great sport, and it was fun, and we were figuring out who we are and what we believed by arguing with each other. And it didn't affect your friendships. That's not the case now is crazy to me. And I think that we're all feeling either that loss, or if you never knew that world, because we were born into this strange bubble of conflict, then you feel some sense of or a lot of alienation or derision or confusion, or you can't be happy, right? This is not a way for humans to live. And so if I can make something that people see and relate to as saying, hey, look, here are funny people, some of whom I recognize, and they're kind of taking the piss out of all this stuff. And I don't have to have a rabid side. I can be a heterodox person. I can, or at least I can believe what I believe, but I don't hate someone who disagrees with me. In fact, I'm kind of curious about them, but I'm afraid to talk to them because I think they're going to hate me, which is more often the reaction than I hate them, so I'm not going to talk to them. It's more, I'm afraid of them because I think they're just going to hate me if I, identify as being whatever. So how do you solve it? I'm hoping that, in Chris Bale's work focuses on this. I think, it's give the center, again, temperamentally center or politically center heterodox, give them an identity, right? It's very easy for me to plant a flag on the left or the right, light it on fire, and attract a whole lot of crazy.
Have you heard of the hopeful majority?
Yes, the hopeful, yes. And I love those guys. And I use their data, actually. I use some of that data in the movie as well. But how do you wrangle the center? It's herding cats, And so if I can make something that people go, I relate to that, let me pass that on to a friend, or let me repost that, or here's a conversation starter. If I send this to my rabidly political uncle, and he goes, oh, hey, that's great, hey, maybe we can talk and have have more of a connection in the conversation, and then maybe people will, it's exactly that, their exhaustion will speak.
Yeah, their exhaustion will speak, and you're almost using a problem that is perpetrated by human nature, which is our desire for clickbait and outrage, and you're using human nature to fight it. And I actually think that's the only way to fight this fight. Is the reason why this podcast is called The Hopeful Majority, is because the idea is that you're trying to build an identity around not the ideological but temperamental center, and you use comedy, you use culture, you use thoughts around the fact that most people just have stopped giving a shit, and I mean, man, I was so happy that you engaged comedians, because humor, I found, is the best way to disarm people because it is fundamentally vulnerable. Like me making a joke with you, I think is the ultimate sign of both respect and a sense that you and I can be friends above politics. So was that like why you got some comedians on board? Like why did you get these quote unquote jesters to
Yeah.
jump onto the film?
I mean, so it's it's multifold. I mean, one is just I love comedians, so it's very selfish. But look, I mean, I was making a thing that involved social science and data and science, and a lot of very serious geeky people, and I love them. But and Chris Bale's brilliant. You know, he's not so funny. And if I'm going to make something that travels, right? That's the other thing about I think a lot of documentaries is they're not. Maybe it's fine if you have an audience and you make them sit there, you let like Clockwork Orange keep their eyelids open and make them watch it. But that's not why people watch something. It's not the best way to engage them. You want something that they're going to choose to watch. So comedians are something that people choose to watch. And as I'm thinking, hey, I've got these great academics. Who do I want to hear talk about this stuff, which I find absurd? Well, who's the best at talking about absurdity and highlighting absurdity?
Hmm.
It's various comedians. So that
And
was
is there a particular reason why you picked the ones that are
yeah,
in the film?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, but to go on for one more
Sure,
second,
go ahead.
which is just that, um, you know, they deal with they travel the country and they will tell you, look, I don't see as I go to small clubs in Dubuque or whatever, I don't see the country that is represented on social media or in media. You know, sure, one person may freak out on me on Twitter, but the whole audience is laughing at whatever I just said. So it's a tiny little, they see it. So they're natural social scientists, right? They're natural psychologists. And so the ones that I kind of hand selected, and there were others, this is, you know, so far the ones I shot for Jesters and Fools are the ones who I could wrangle for a few shoot dates. Really, and
Mm.
Lewis Black, whose material I haven't used yet. That'll be for the larger documentary. These are the ones who, for me, have credibility because they will fire in every direction. You know, they don't have a side that they are so protective of that they won't criticize. You
Mhm.
know, and so if you are whatever, let's say you lean left, but you're willing to call out the hypocrisy of the left, or you just don't identify with any side whatsoever, you can just call out hypocrisy or irony or absurdity. You have credibility
Sure.
for me. So I definitely, I steered away from people uh, have who have identified themselves too closely with any political side, because I do want it to be something that people can't make any assumptions about. They can't just take a look and go, "Oh, I know who's in that," so I'm not gonna.
Is
I have
Dave
no
Chappelle out of bounds?
I mean, look, I should be so lucky to get Dave Chappelle, right? I don't know. It's a very good question. He's brilliant.
Hmm.
His ability to call bullshit on everyone is unmatched. Uh, Strategically, do I think that I don't know? I think I'd love to have Dave Chappelle.
Yeah.
I'm sure I would love to have Dave Chappelle.
I
Sure.
asked because on episode I think 12 or 13 it was I had a great conversation with Andrew Yang, and part of the reason why at least Andrew says that he got on the map was because him and Dave were very close friends, and Dave Chappelle basically did a bunch of comedy shows for him for the campaign. By the way, imagine Dave Chappelle being your freaking campaign show horse, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Imagine Dave Chappelle opens for all of your different political events. Man, you're getting everybody out there. And again, it goes to like you use basic human skills, techniques, decency, just speak the fucking human nature to reach people, and it works. And so naturally the question becomes, well, you've got this film out and you mentioned that there's this like bigger project that you're up to. So what's next? Are you going to bring on Dave Chappelle? Are you going to like do this massive are you going
So
to go to all the different clubs? What's your deal, Rob?
let me tell you
What are you trying to do?
how this works and how
Are you
this
going to
does.
sell out
You
to the
do not
outrage
just
complex?
you do not just bring on Dave Chappelle. That's not.
Believe it or
I
not,
am
you
not that
actually
guy.
that's actually how it works. He's a this is a total tangent, but it's so interesting. So what's interesting about Dave Chappelle is that he will do stuff that seems extraordinarily ordinary, and I think that's actually a way in which he stays in touch. Like apparently if you go to the place that he lives in Ohio, like it's in the middle of nowhere,
Yeah.
you'll just find him like walking the grocery store.
Yeah.
And so hey, that's what you should do. You should set up camp in his town and go find him.
I'll let you go do that for me, and you convince him. I promise you, it ain't that easy.
Sounds good.
I'll
Only for
set
the small price of my student loans, I will go and do that.
that. There you go. You can be an exec producer if you bring on Dave Chappelle. I mean, look, I set up camp at the Comedy Cellar in Greenwich Village. Is what I did. The owner
Okay.
of the Comedy Cellar, or co-owner, Noam Dwarman, was hugely supportive. He's like, look, because I went to him like, no, I met him. I reached out to him. I need comedians, and you have them all. They all started there, and what do I do? He's like, look, just come and be here. Just hang out, be a fly on the wall, and slowly you'll get to know people. I'll get you a seat at the table, and he's like, look, you can't jump anybody, and you got to give them the space, and there's the table that they sit at. You got to be very respectful of it. And so, I mean, I went all Jane Goodall, and I sat there, making no sudden motions, being very quiet until
with the species that are comedians.
With the species that are comedians, and eventually someone hands you a banana, and they're like, "What the hell are you doing here?" And you're like, "Well, I just happened to be making a movie." And so, as I got to know everybody, and people introduced me to other people and whatnot, you kind of organically find the people who are into what you're into. So that said, the next step for this one is I took the footage that I had thus far. I wanted to do something operational now because it takes a long time. So this is Jesters and Fools came out of it. And now I will continue to shoot, but we're going to stage a social science experiment with Chris Bale at Duke and make a multi-part, what I think should be a multi-part series ultimately.
And is it going to be a series on the people in the experiment? Is it going to be more comedians?
It'll be the people. We'll take people, put them through the experiment. We'll watch them in their lives and see what happens to them.
Oh, interesting. You'll put them through his experiment.
We'll put them through his experiment. And then there are many tangents that we take with other social scientists and journalists and psychologists demonstrating these different principles. What happens to us in this environment? And this can be status seeking, it can be tribalism, all these things, and give visuals, experiential visuals to an audience so they can walk away with it. And then my comedians are the philosopher kings. They come in and out with observations on these different things, be it tribalism or their experiences online. And by the time you get to the end, you have what I hope will be this multidimensional experience of our moment and of what happens to us in these social media environments that uses science and emotional stories of the people who are going through the experiment, humor and art from the comedians. Because look, if you want to make an argument to someone, you can write a white paper and 12 people read it. Right. But if you want to make something that convinces, that changes a mind,
culturally compelling,
that's really compelling and that travels on its own, it needs emotion. It's got to be good storytelling. And so that is, I think, the other thing about so many political documentaries is that they're not really, right?
Yeah.
They're not structured well for storytelling. I mean, you can say there's a lack of conflict. That doesn't mean people have to be yelling at each other. Right. But there's a question. There's someone who's in search of an answer. And so it's good storytelling.
That's interesting. So you're going to essentially run an experiment live, and you're going to track the people that are going through that experiment. You're going to tell their story of how they, I guess, go insane, and you're going to have comedians talk about it.
Yeah, and I don't think I'll have the comedians talking about them in particular. It'll be more their personal observations.
Okay.
But it'll be thematically, it will interview.
So how do you ensure that the people that are going to be in this documentary have like authentic and real reactions with cameras, and like how are you gonna manage all that?
Well,
I'm just so curious.
That's the great question of all things you observe. That's just a good Heisenberg.
Yeah, how are you going to be the ultimate Jane Goodall to these?
It's uncertainty principle. look, I mean, you can't. And to say this, I'll say this: it will be, Chris Bale's experiment light, because once you do this, it's not true science. Something, someone's aware, they're being observed. So that said, the experiment's been done twice at Duke, once by, I think it was an MIT Harvard group, with the exact same results. So you come out with, in the beginning, look, this is the, for demonstration purposes only version, but it is not hard, to tweak people and to get them to, this is just the reaction people have. And everyone else who, these people will go nuts, and then others will go, I'm out. I said one reasonable thing during some online conversation that was conciliatory towards, the other side, and my own side came and took me out for not being pure enough. Right. And that happens time and again.
So as we sort of near the end of this conversation, there's so many places we could take this. I wasn't actually originally thinking about doing this, but it just came to my mind. Is I've got like 3 very quick questions that just are coming to my mind as you're talking about this, and I give you 20 to 30 seconds to answer each of them, and we're gonna do our best to feed the outrage industrial complex. Okay.
Oh man.
So 3 quick thought experiments. You got 30 seconds to answer each of them. It's like a cable news segment, and you gotta speak in clips. Think about this. This is shareable TikTok clips.
Have you noticed I ramble? So that's gonna be hard. Okay, go.
So tomorrow you snap your fingers and social media is gone. Good or bad?
That's great.
Okay.
I got nothing else for you, man. Good.
Tomorrow,
hands down, we should totally ban TikTok. I'm all for it.
Okay. Is tomorrow you get to think about and create a documentary with President Trump and President Biden. What question would you ask each of them?
I don't know. I don't even know that it matters in a way. Like, I don't know what they represent. I honestly don't know what they represent ideologically. I don't know what Trump represents ideologically. I don't know. I certainly don't know what he represents ideologically. Biden, I don't know what he represents to us ideologically. I don't have an answer for you.
I think that's most of the country.
Yeah. I guess that's it.
Okay. What forget politics for a second. If you could, assuming you have all the money in the world and you want to make a documentary about any subject you could possibly pick that isn't politics, what would that be? And you can take a moment. I'm just curious.
Honest to God, I mean, look, I'll say this, that there are a few different projects that I'm playing with right now, and every one of them is connected to this idea, and they're not political necessarily, but they're all connected to this idea that we misunderstand each other, certainly ourselves, and that we have far less to fear from our neighbor than we think we do. And I think a lot of people find that in their work there are these connected everything. Every Mike Nichols, directors will say, everyone makes really just one movie, and Michael will say, like, I made one movie my whole life, and whatever his theme was. Right now, that's certainly where my head goes. I hate conflict. I hate seeing people in conflict, and I think so much of it is unnecessary, and I find it painful. So I think so much of what I'm focusing on, no matter what it is how much we misunderstand each other, and the chaos and horror that results.
So the last question that I ask every guest, no matter who they are, is about their why. Why do you do what it is that you do? Because I think that question really helps you understand who the person is. When we have, hot button cultural or political figures on, it helps the audience understand okay, who actually is Vivek Ramaswamy, right? Or who is Marianne Williamson? When we have an intellectual, it's why does Jonathan Haidt read all these books? What's his purpose? And so I want to ask you that question, but I want to ask you in a slightly different way, because you just talked about the fact that of all the different things you could be making movies or films about, it is about the way that people misunderstand each other. Why do you care so much about making films and documentaries and exploring the subject of misunderstanding at this moment in our history? And what about this work draws you so much to this? Why this?
I mean, look, it's a few things. I mean, one, I think storytelling is problem solving. It's a process of problem solving. You're working out an answer for yourself. It's very selfish. Let me go explore this question. And through either writing fiction or exploring through documentary, I'm trying to find an answer for myself and then share it because, that's the compulsion, I guess. And, the filmmaking disease is you kind of keep coming back to that. Or what story can I tell out of that? It's just, it just pops into your head. It's compulsively, it's awful. But you have to go and tell a story. Why now? I think it's the existential question. And even very selfishly, again, it's all selfish. But if I can't have an interesting discussion with somebody, then I don't have anything to talk about. I got no golf conversation. I can't talk football, right? But I do really want to know how you live and how you grew up and why you think. I'm just curious. And so this has stolen conversation from me.
It's made you into a hermit. You can't talk football, and you're basically a nerd now. You can't have conversations with anybody.
That is it. It's it. My sport. If I can't debate with you, I got nothing. So I need us to be able to have good, healthy arguments so that I can stop talking to myself in my room.
Are you more comfortable being the main character in a story or telling a story?
Oh God, no. There's a reason I'm behind camera. I'm not supposed to be on camera.
I mean, all right. Well, you are aware this is on camera, right? This is being recorded. You understand that?
As a journalist, look, I used to host many conversations with filmmakers. I do enjoy it, but no, I would not. I would much rather let these people, be it the comedians or the scientists, I would much rather position them to speak well for themselves and just put them in their best light. And me, I'm just in the background, and you don't know from me.
Well, Rob, thank you so much for joining the Hopeful Majority. Thanks for not being on the background. And I hope that one day you can overcome your withdrawal of leaving New York. As an ex-New Jersey, and I will tell you that it is rough out there in the world being from New Jersey, but you'll get through it.
I am not from New Jersey, and fuck you.
With that, Rob Feld, everybody. Thank you so much to Rob for joining. That was quite the way to end it. We went from conflict entrepreneurs, outrage, politics to New Jersey. And as a fellow New Jerseyan, if there's any other New Jerseyans out there, I share your pain. Hey, every Monday, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your content, we're trying to build a world in which we incentivize nuance, we fight outrage, because we as people are much more complex than we are perceived to be online. It's time to change that. There's a hopeful majority of us out there. I appreciate you joining. If you're on Spotify, Apple, please leave a review. If you're on YouTube, subscribe, like. I'll see you on the last episode of the Hopeful Majority for 2023. I can't believe that it'll be 30 weeks in a week. I'll see you then.